Hey folks, how you guys doing? Hope you're all having a great day today. I'm going to quickly walk you through the design process before we actually get into the shop and start building. So this is a project or an image that someone sent me and asked me if I could make it for them. Now for the vast majority of times, 99% of every time that I get asked to make something, I always have to decline because my business is not set up to take on commissioned work. However, I thought that this project would be interesting. The process of creating this would be interesting, to make a stacked ring assembly for the base and then turn it on the lathe. I haven't turned much on the lathe in a while, so sure, I'll take it on. I asked the person to give me some dimensions, and from there I went into SketchUp to create an assembly that would allow me to actually create the project. And this is what I came up with. If I turn on X-ray mode, you can see that it is a hollow assembly, and the Lazy Susan mechanism is hidden in the top right here. The top itself is 2 rings stacked, which I later changed that idea to a single one simply for material waste and material availability for the hardwood top. The bottom is going to be painted, so I figured I'd go ahead and use an inexpensive lumber like Southern Yellow Pine. And this looked like a good construction setup. So I've got a bunch of rings that are the same size, and then one that sits down inside a rabbet for locating purposes. All that's glued together and then turned on the lathe. So after that, I rounded over the top edges just for a little bit better look, and then got a profile section of the usable material, which is represented here. With that profile section, I drew some curves just to kind of get that same look as the original, and it also lets me know how much material I have to work with for the shaping. And I took this area and rotated along the circle on the bottom and was given this. Now if I set this side by side with the original, let me go back to the original, it looks close enough, right? So with that approval, I took the same shape over here, duplicated it to the other side, printed this off, and then I wrote down all the necessary dimensions that I needed for all of the different design elements, I guess you could say, and also determined how far they were from the bottom. I got all the dimensions that I needed to create a nice turning, printed that off, wrote those down, and then took all of these rings, laid them flat on a different layer so that I could just basically open this up in my CNC software and cut these out very quickly. Back in the shop, the project begins with the base material, and because this base will be stained and painted, I went with just regular 2x12 pine. Although this base will be distressed, I did make sure to cut around any knots that were in the board, just for stability reasons. And I cut a bunch of pieces that were long enough for 2 rings each. These smaller pieces were then jointed on one wide face, and with a board this wide, I can't really grab the side of the board, so I need to rely on the friction between my hand and the surface of the wood to push the material through. In this case, my hands were slipping. It's wintertime, my hands are a little bit dry and cracky, and I really wish I could use a long flat push block that has a hook on the back to pull the wood through. But that would require me to take the guard off completely, which is something that I don't want to do because I like that the cutter is always covered with this style guard. So the next best thing is to add more grip to my hands. And I like these particular gloves because they add grip without a thick barrier like typical utility gloves. No edge jointing here, everything's going to be cut out of the inside, so just flatten one face and then plane the other flat and parallel. For all of these cuts, I'm using a 3/8 of an inch spiral bit, and this is a perfect time to mention that I'm doing some advertising work for Bits and Bits. So if you want to get great quality router bits, then check them out and use the code JBates15 for 15% off. And you can also use that code twice until March of 2020. For this first piece, I wanted to show the cut without dust collection so you can see the router bit work. And never again. I'm not going to do that again. One cut without dust collection is all I needed to appreciate good dust collection. This bit through material all over the place, and I should have stopped mid-cut and installed the dust boot, but I let the cut finish, clean up the mess, and then proceeded with the next one. This one, much better. No more chips and dust spraying everywhere. And yeah, I'm never going to cut without the dust boot again. On all of these cuts, I did not add tabs to the toolpath. Instead, I made sure to pull the ring away from the bit as it finished the cut. And although it's not that big of a deal, it does save some time dealing with all of the tabs, rinse and repeat for the rest of the rings. On the bottom ring, I did not remove the center waist. Instead, I just made a shallow inside perimeter cut to indicate where the hollow center will be and made a shallow pocket the same size as the lathe faceplate. This will allow me to solidly mount the assembly to the lathe and also provide a cut line for reference, which will make sense when I go to remove the rest of the bottom later on. Then the rest of the rings will stack on top, and finally the Lazy Susan ring will be glued in place. The rabbet on the top full-size ring is to locate the Lazy Susan ring, and I could have made the top ring the same size, but doing it this way will slightly reduce the waste while on the lathe. I'm using quick setting glue, so I don't mind doing this in stages. The first 3 pairs were glued together, then the bottom was added to 1 pair and the other 2 pairs were glued together, and I'll glue these 2 assemblies together while on the lathe. Shortly after that, the faceplate is added to the bottom, and on the top assembly, I forgot to have the CNC cut a center hole for locating on the live center on the lathe, so I used the drill press to get as close to center as I could. The final glue up was done on the lathe between centers. Here you can see how much I was off, and it's not a huge amount, but I was hoping to have everything line up just a little bit better. Some of this is error on aligning each ring during gluing, and some of it is in the tailstock center hole being drilled by eye and not in the perfect center on the CNC machine. I let the glued up assembly sit on the lathe overnight while I started on the top platform, and for that I used a wide section of a weathered ash slab. As I'm looking over the footage for this step, I have no idea why I chose to bring the slab inside and use a handsaw versus simply bringing a battery-powered circular saw outside. But anyway, the section was cut off for the top platform. Now the dirt in the bark is likely to dull the jointer knives, so I first removed the bark at the bandsaw, then the section is jointed flat, and then planed parallel. Now I've only recently used ash for the first time, and it's quickly becoming one of my favorite woods to work with. It's inexpensive, it machines easily, stains and finishes easily, and it's just beautiful. Not much machining is needed for the top, just a simple pocket to locate the Lazy Susan mechanism and the perimeter cut. After the top was cut out, I noticed a crack in the piece, and this was likely a small check or crack on the end of the slab that I did not see, but as the circle was cut out, it likely released enough internal stresses within the board that the crack opened up for me to notice it. The solution is to stabilize it by filling it with epoxy. The next day, the turning can begin on the base, and I haven't turned anything in a while, so I started with carbide tools, and after a nasty catch, immediately switched to something I'm a little bit more familiar with, which is a bowl gouge. It took me a few minutes to get back into the swing of turning, but I still realize I am no expert at the lathe. It's a lot of fun, but I still need to take my time. Having a profile of all the dimensions sitting on the lathe with me for reference was pretty helpful though. I made a few reference pencil lines on the turning and then just compared it to the dimensions on the paper as I went. Of course, very light, frequent sharpening will keep the tool performing at its best and result in a smoother surface on the wood. After a few joyful minutes, the turning is done and the mess has to go. I really enjoy turning and I really dislike the mess that it creates. Even with a face shield, shirt, leather apron, all that, I always feel so itchy while turning. Before removing the piece from the lathe, I applied a water-based brown mahogany stain. This is just a base coat that will be covered, so I let it really soak in before wiping off the excess. And while the stain dries, I took the top platform to the router table to add a round over on both the top and bottom edge, followed by a little bit of sanding, and then some more water-based stain is applied to the ash top. This surface will not be getting the same additional layers as the base, so wiping it off as soon as possible is necessary so that the grain is still visible. Back at the lathe, the water-based stain is dry, so I applied a white water-based stain blocker, followed by a white water-based polyurethane. I went back to the top platform and applied a couple thin coats of shellac, and while these coats dried, I jumped back and forth to the base to try and distress it a little bit. And I wouldn't consider myself good at distressing, but I would also say that I have no desire to put forth the effort to get good at distressing. It's just not for me. But this project wasn't for me, so I gave it a shot. After the shellac dried, I could really see the filled crack in the top. It wasn't a huge eyesore, and honestly, looking back on it, probably nobody would have noticed, but it was distracting to me. And here's where I made a bad judgment decision. Instead of leaving it alone, I thought I could overpower the filled crack distraction with a decorative distraction. Thinking it would be a fun twist on the project, I carved the words "leftovers are for quitters" on the top. This was then filled with a white pigmented epoxy, and I let it sit overnight. Now the faceplate can be removed and the bottom hole cut, and this is where the shallow groove comes into play on the bottom, as it lets me know where to cut with the jigsaw. To mount the Lazy Susan, a through hole is needed in the base, and really only one hole is needed here, as you can rotate the mechanism to get to the rest of the screw locations from one hole, but I drilled 4 holes for some reason. Back to the epoxy lettering on the top. This is what I had in mind for the text, a white letter that contrasts nicely with the wood. This is the same white epoxy in a walnut coaster set that I made a little while ago, and it turned out great with no problems. The epoxy in this project did not turn out great, and it's completely my fault. I failed to take into consideration that the dark wood in this project was stained dark, and as I flushed the epoxy with the surface, I was forced to restain the piece, and while restaining the piece, I accidentally stained the letters, and I just had to wash over the whole thing. In the end, it's a kind of like a failed attempt at adding a fun spin on the project. The weird kind of low contrast lettering is just as distracting as the crack now, but oh well, let's move on. The Lazy Susan mechanism is briefly attached to the top just to establish the screw holes, and then permanently attached to the base. With everything upside down, I can use a few driver extensions to secure the top, and with that, this project is done. Now, other than the frustration of accidentally staining the white letters on top, I really enjoyed making this project. It's kind of a fun way to get back on the lathe, and a good design experiment for a project that I doubt I would have made on my own. That's it for this project and video. If you like this project, be sure to check out my website at jayscustomcreations.com and sign up for my email newsletter. Not everything that I publish makes it to this YouTube channel, whereas everything I publish makes it to my website. So have a great day, and I'll talk to you in the next one.